Haku haku. We can all please be seated so we can get started. Then I ask you to sit, but can you please stand? Ta'inoon for a blessing. No halakwel, kia kinale ne chaksi, kia la hutu e la shinin, kia skene na pikiliki yu, akitala wahach, kali wish, shi ushkalsh, iki ala kilimu, naki atuk, no halakwel, tani kiliki yu, naki iskon, naki chichihi, na hayaluhpan, kia kinale no halakwel, ila piyiki yu. Great Creator, we are grateful to you for this day. We pray to you. We ask that you watch over us as we work together with an open mind and an open heart. Creator, we do this work for ancestors. We do this work for our tribes. Please walk with us during this journey and help us create a path of healing. Creator, please help us be here in a good way, respecting each other and this space. Creator, please watch over our families and our children, our elders, and all those who are sick. We are grateful to you, Creator, for all you give us. Ho. Please be seated. Kaschohasukin, haku, maktukakushi, alapalahulapu, nisamalachumash. Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Kathleen Marshall. I am Samala Chumash from the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. On behalf of the Elders Council and the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, we welcome you to the home of our ancestors, Samala Chumash people. It is an honor to co-host this event today with the University of California, Santa Barbara. The work we do together under NAGPRA is not just about compliance. It's about empathy and understanding. It's about recognizing the wrong that was done to our ancestors. And it's about recognizing the need for our ancestors to be put to rest with all of their belongings. And finally, it's about recognizing our need to heal from all of the injustice that our people have endured. We hope this training will not only provide some answers, but also some insights to both sides of the table. We must work together to create this path of reconciliation. I would like to acknowledge all tribal leaders here today, and I would like to acknowledge all of the Chumash people from the north to the south. As we move forward, let us commit ourselves to the principles of stewardship and collaboration. Together, we can ensure that the legacy of California Native American cultures is presented, protected, and respected. Kiaki Naliu, thank you all. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to get a little bit of housekeeping done. So the bathrooms are right outside this door. We have the food and water, and you can reach out to me and Akia or Wendy if you have any questions. The internet service is Chumash Guest. And thank you. Thank you all for coming. Oh, wait, I'm supposed to introduce someone. I would like to introduce one of our tribal members and the chair of the Native American Heritage Commission, Reggie Pagling, to say a few words.
Aku, welcome, and blessings to you all. I know you took a little time here today to join us, and those of you online, we really appreciate all that you do. From the Native American Heritage Commission, you know, I think I am the eldest on the commission now, am I not? Yeah, a little over a decade or so, but what's important is the fact that we've been working on these regulations since then, and it's almost to that point where we can actually have some real solid regulations and guidelines by which communities can help to preserve and maintain our cultural integrity. You know, it's been real difficult to try to get these out. I was hoping that we could complete these by the time I leave office, and it's almost going to get there in time. But it's been such a long time, and I'm so enthralled by looking at this audience and knowing that you guys have a task to go ahead and interpret this for your communities, to go ahead and help them understand, to go ahead and help them succeed in preserving what is theirs. there's many hurdles we've come across, and I believe I get right on the edge sometimes, and maybe that's what keeps me there. I think Wendy says that about me. I'm good trouble. I'm happy to be that. I think I told Governor Jerry Brown one time that you were late, because he was coming in during a time when I was singing. So I had to tell him, us first, even though he was a governor. I had to let him go. But it was okay. They knew where we were at. He knew where we were at. So for you to be here in your communities, doing what you do, gosh, I can barely fathom how much progress this has come about. To see these faces, to see the new students that were in high school and college when I started this long time ago, and now to see you here sitting down, it makes my heart warm. I know it makes our job a little bit more difficult at the Heritage Commission and trying to help with doing this work, but I know that we've got some great people. If you haven't met our tribal, what we call him, the 11th Commissioner, Sam Cohen, he's quite a big help to all of us. Wendy Teeter, our former chair, Laura Miranda, and I know she's out there right now, the Vice Chairman, Buffy McQuillan. These are your experts. Lean on them. Call them. Ask those questions. This is what you're looking for, the understanding. These are your people that can do this. But I believe I'm not going to reiterate what Kathy said in collaboration and working together with everybody. Yeah, let's do that. Let's get beyond that step. Get over your differences. Move forward for the best of everyone else. You all have a safe trip back home after today. I hope you gather a great amount of information. You bond, you collaborate, you make new friends, new contacts, and as I said, don't be afraid of the wall. Kick it down, get over it, get your understanding that you need to help your group, and give yourself a solid foundation. Someone once said that as we go through the Heritage Commission and new commissioners come on, we stand on the shoulders of those who were here before us. So I'm happy to stand on those shoulders. And for the next group coming up, I'm glad to be here, part of your foundation, so you can stand on mine. Thank you very much.
Haku haku ila, maktuka nakia zavala, ala palahulapo, nisamala chumashino. I just wanted to welcome everybody. I'm the tribe's TIPO officer as well as the cultural director for the tribe, and I joined my native sister here in doing this repatriation work. As we all know, it's very taxing emotionally. It takes a lot of time, and thank God our tribe has resources because a lot of tribes don't have that luxury. So I wanted to come up and welcome you as well as introduce Gary McPherson, the Vice Chancellor for the University of California at Santa Barbara. They are our partners in this training today. I'm also sit on the UCSB NAGPRA Campus Committee. We have our great chair, Christina Gonzalez, and Kathleen Marshall also sits on that committee. And I can't tell you what a difference it means to have tribal people on these committees. We're able to represent and be part of the process and really at the table of decision-making and representation. So I want to thank the NHC for making sure that happened, because that's very important. So with that said, Gary.
Thank you, Nakia, and good morning. I'm going to spend a few minutes with you this morning, and then I'm going to be moving on, but I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and it is remarkable to see the number of people I'm looking at out here in the audience. In addition, I understand we have an online presence that's pretty significant as well. Did Christina join us online? Online, great. So we have all of the most important people to UC Santa Barbara that are joining us today, and we're joining them as well. So part of the privilege that I have in working with many of the folks that you'll meet today is that I am the Chancellor's designee on all matters related to NAGPRA. Now, that sounds like a lofty position and title, but it really doesn't mean an awful lot without recognition of the people who really lift me up and do the real hard work in the trenches. But let me talk a little bit about, for just a few moments, the journey over the last couple of years. And I'll introduce a few folks that are on stage and in the audience and thank them, because as Nakia mentioned and Kathleen, this is an opportunity for us all to work together and to be grateful and thankful for the work that each of us are doing. So about 4 years ago, I received a phone call from the chancellor at UC Santa Barbara. He said, "Gary, what do you know about NAGPRA?" And I'll be frank and honest, I'd heard of it, didn't know much about it. I knew that there was legislation, didn't know any of the details. But I've spent the last 4.5 years with the assistance of Mike Miller, who's in the audience this morning. And I asked the chancellor, I said, who's gonna help me do this? Because I already had 14 departments and 1,200 employees that were reporting up to my office. And he said, well, you have a couple of options. And he gave me 3 names. And the one that stood out was Michael Miller. And I knew Michael from the work that he had done with our student affairs. He's always been very effective. He was encouraged. He was always positive. And he was the type of influence that I needed to do the work that NAGPRA was going to require us to do. And so we joined forces almost 4 years ago, or about 4 years ago now. And the first thing that we started talking about was, what is our operating principles going to be? Who are we in this journey? And we came up with a couple of principles that talked about that. And the first one was, we said we're going to own the mistakes of our past, both ours as well as our institutions. And secondarily, we're going to tell the truth every time, even when it was painful. What we did next is actually cemented the work that we've been doing, and that is that we held each other accountable for those principles. And we still do this every single day. And then along the way, we acquired some people who were even smarter than we were and even better than we were. And one of those individuals is Hugh Ratty, who's here in the audience today, who began about 6 months ago, but it seems like a decade ago because he's accomplished so much. And then lastly, the work that's being done at UC Santa Barbara, which is, it would not be done if not for the patience of our colleagues here at Santa Ynez, as well as the Elders Council. On a number of occasions where they didn't need to be patient, they were, and we're grateful for that. So lastly, let me recognize a few folks, one of which is here from our committee on campus. We have 3 faculty members and 3 Native American members on our campus committee. Dr. Greg Johnson is here joining us today, so thank you for being here, Greg. Dr. John Danke and Stuart Smith are also members of that committee, along with 2 of the folks that are on the stage, Kathleen and Nakia, and Christina, who is joining us online. So thank you for all of them. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for treating us well and teaching us the way that we should be operating. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day.
Come on, Wendy.
I know. Sorry, I should have been more positioned. I want to thank everybody. My name is Wendy Teeter. I'm the Cultural Resources Archaeologist for Santa Ynez Banishee Indians, and I'm also the retired Senior Curator for the Fowler Museum at UCLA and Repatriation Coordinator, where I worked since 1993 on NAGPRA. So it's been a long time. I thought I would finish repatriation at UCLA before I retired, but I am grateful to Allison Fisher Olson for taking over and carrying that ball down to the next stage. I wanted to welcome you all again and also introduce our new panel. So Melanie, Mario, and Michelle, thank you all. This is such a delight. This is my retirement dream job, is getting to work for the tribe. And it is a lot better to work on the non-academic side, I will be honest. So we're going to have this first panel. We'll be working with the new regulations and how we can work together. And Mario is here. from the Native American Heritage Commission, as is Michelle Carr. And then online, unfortunately, I really, really wanted Melanie to be here in person. She really, really wanted to be here in person. But as often is the case, she was pulled to another meeting the day before. So she is joining us virtually. And hopefully we can get Melanie on screen.
Hi, everyone.
And please help yourself to food and beverage, and we'll continue to have these panels. All of the panels are set up so that they will be presenting remarks, and then there will be time for Q&A. We have one microphone that is situated, I think it was supposed to be situated over here, and so when you have questions, we'll have it kind of lined up, and that way we can make sure that the people online can actually see you, so that they can stay fully engaged, and we'll be moderating, so we'll be going back and forth between. And there she is, the lovely Melanie. All right, well, I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me. I can no longer see you, so hopefully you can hear me. If somebody could somehow let me know that you can hear me, that would be great.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Melanie. Can you hear us?
I can, Michelle. Thank you so much. Well, that's an awfully big screen there in the room. I feel like a giant. But thank you again for the opportunity. I want to extend my thanks to Santa Ynez in particular for coordinating this and for making it available to me remotely. I do apologize that I was unable to join you in person, but I appreciate that I have the opportunity to speak with you today. And I know that Mario and Michelle are there in the room, and we have developed a short presentation focused around 4 sort of basic questions that come up most often when we're talking about the federal law and the state law and how they work together. We're going to sort of run through those 4 questions and our answers to them, but then we will have plenty of time for discussion after that. As well as we have some other material that we can talk about if necessary. So with that, I think Mario or Michelle, if you wanted to say any words of introduction.
Hello, my name is Mario Polari. I'm staff counsel for the Native American Heritage Commission. Some of you may know me from interacting on Cal NAGPRA. I focus mainly on Cal NAGPRA, and now I'm wearing many different hats. So I appreciate the hospitality. Reggie, thank you for having us here. And Wendy, thank you for putting this wonderful event together. I know there's teams behind you as well, and I'd like to thank them. So for the hospitality, gratitude. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Carr. I'm Chief Counsel to the Native American Heritage Commission, and I'm glad to be here today and grateful to be able to have this conversation. We know with the release of the new federal NAGPRA regulations in January, there has been a lot of, I guess, consternation on some people's parts and confusion on some people's parts, maybe even including my part. But we're working through this together, and we're glad we have Melanie in DC as our partner in this. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it has been a good partnership and relationship that we've been working on developing between the federal National NAGPRA program and the NHC folks. So we're looking forward to continuing to make this work easier to understand, to have less frustration and consternation, and certainly to make it easier for everybody to achieve the ultimate goal, which is to find a way for respectful repatriation and return of ancestors and cultural items to the places that they belong. So I will go ahead and start out our points of discussion today. I want to start by saying that, when we talked about this presentation, we actually had a slightly different title. And I would add just that the title for this session, we might want to amend it to be Working Better Together. Because I think that's our ultimate goal here, is to find ways that we can do better with the foundation that these two laws have provided for those of you in California. We know that in some cases it is working, in some cases it works together, and it certainly can, but we want to see if we can't even improve how things are working and make it work better. So the first point that we wanted to discuss today is who is involved in NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA. This is often one of the biggest issues in the differences between NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA, and we wanted to put it right up here in front. We didn't want to wait to get to this issue. As I think many of you in the room are aware, one of the biggest differences between NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA has to do with the role of those Indian tribes that do not have federal recognition. And the federal law, as is indicated by the federal part, sometimes I make a reference to the federal blazer that I'm issued and wear, because it only relates to federally recognized tribes. And in fact, the revisions and the regulations emphasize and prioritize the role and rights of federally recognized tribes. However, it's important to remember that the federal law does not exclude those Indian groups without federal recognition. Certainly, Indian groups without federal recognition can be included in consultation and can be included if the federally recognized tribes agree in the repatriation and rebury or whatever the outcome is of the NAGPRA process. But the federal law does highlight, strengthen, and sort of double down on the role of the federally recognized tribes in the federal process. Mario, would you like to add to that?
Thanks, Melanie. I would like to add to that. So CalNAGPRA requires, the CalNAGPRA process requires consultation with both federally recognized and non-federally recognized California tribes. In light of the new NAGPRA regs, the consultation with those non-federally recognized tribes is more about relationship building and building those conversations and that respectful consultation in the event that the repatriation does not go forward through NAGPRA. There's opportunities for relationships to be leveraged later on in the process with non-federally recognized tribes.
Thanks, Mario. We'll move on to our second point now, which is what is required to be in compliance with NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA. For NAGPRA, there's some basic requirements on the part of a museum or federal agency that constitute compliance with the federal law. First and foremost, compliance requires consultation. Consultation is the foundation of the federal law and is a necessary part of any action under NAGPRA, under the federal NAGPRA law. Beyond consultation, of course, there are documents that must be submitted to my office, the National NAGPRA Program, to be in compliance with the federal law. Those are summaries of cultural items, inventories of human remains and associated funerary objects, Federal Register notices, and under the new regulations, an additional document called a repatriation statement, which completes the regulatory and paperwork process under the federal rule. A change in the new regulations and the new federal regulations is a requirement for notices for human remains and associated funerary objects. these notices have always been required under the law since 1990. But what has changed is the timeline under which those notices for human remains and associated funerary objects must be submitted to my office. So we have tried in these new regulations to implement some new timelines. The general timeline for human remains and associated funerary objects under the new regulations is for museums and federal agencies to complete their inventories of human remains and associated funerary objects by January of 2029, or 5 years after the new regulations were published. And then notices are required 6 months later. So as Wendy said in her introduction, she had hoped to achieve some completion before her retirement. I am looking not to my retirement necessarily, but to July of 2029, when all of this work will be done, at least for the human remains and associated funerary objects. Now, I realize that there are opportunities for extensions of those timelines by museums and federal agencies, but extensions are only available with the consent of the consulting parties. And so it's, I do look forward to that time in 2029, where we can see a lot more of this work, at least in the regulatory process, completed. Maria, did you want to add to that for what is required to be in compliance with CalNAGPRA?
I would, thank you. And this is often a question that we get the most from practitioners that are trying to satisfy the CalNAGPRA requirements while also going through NAGPRA. First and foremost, as Melanie said, consultation under CalNAGPRA is kind of one of the core rights that tribes have in the language that's written into CalNAGPRA. So consultation throughout is most definitely not only a best practice, but a requirement at the bare minimum. And there is a definition of consultation, and that's respectful and equitable, and that's codified in statute as well. Moving forward to kind of more of the paperwork requirements that we have in CalNAGPRA, we have a process through CalNAGPRA that allows you to utilize the documents that you've already filled out for NAGPRA, inventories or summaries or notices, to satisfy the requirements of CalNAGPRA. And we've developed a database that can take that information that you're submitting for NAGPRA and use it to satisfy and move forward along on the CalNAGPRA process. If anyone has any questions of that, we do in-depth walkthroughs of the database. I'm still kind of learning it myself. It's a very new system that we put in the last year, but we are open and willing to help walk anyone through that process as well. Thanks, Melanie.
Great. We'll move on to our third discussion question or point. And that is, when is action required under NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA? And I think I got ahead of myself here in that I've already answered this question with the new timeline under the new regulations. Again, for human remains and associated funerary objects, inventories must be completed by January of 2029, and that must include consultation. So consultation must occur before that January 2029 deadline. For other cultural items, summaries were due in 1993 or within 6 months of acquiring a new collection. There is no requirement under the new regulations to redo the summary process. However, if a museum or a federal agency has additional cultural items that were never submitted in a summary, those are required and have been required within 6 months of acquiring those items. An additional change in the new regulations, or really I should say a clarification in the new federal regulations, is the timeline for responding to a request for repatriation. This was previously called the 90-day rule, and it was kind of confusing about how it applied in the old regulations. And we've tried to be very clear that once a museum or federal agency receives a request for repatriation, they must respond to that request within 90 days. And the response from a museum or federal agency must be clear in what the decision of the museum or federal agency is, either that they're accepting the request or that they're denying the request and they're providing information for why they're denying that request. Our overall hope here is that this will improve the transparency of information between museums and tribes when it comes to these requests for repatriation, as well as impose a deadline. Many of you in the room are probably familiar or maybe have personal experience in cases of repatriation where it has taken years, if not in some cases decades, to finalize an answer from a museum or federal agency on a request for repatriation. And the goal with these revised regulations is to give a clear deadline for a response, so that tribes can then take whatever action they wish to take based on that response. But to end this sort of endless period of back and forth or discussion over a request and get to some clear decision making on the part of museums and federal agencies that can then give tribes more options for what comes next. I think that was all of the points that I wanted to cover here. Mario?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. One note that I forgot about the paperwork is that the NAHC also should receive any repatriation agreements that are completed through NAGPRA. We are going to be acting as a tracking and a transparent database so that there's clarity both on the state and the federal level. In regards to actions required under CalNAGPRA, CalNAGPRA and NAGPRA are designed to run concurrently and in parallel. And there's mechanisms, as I mentioned before, on our database that allow for those two statutes or those two processes to run in tandem and be tracked transparently. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Mario. And we'll just we'll go on and wrap up our presentation here with the last point or question that we came up with. And really overall, in general, what is required by NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA? So apart from the sort of specifics we've talked about with documentation and timelines, generally what's required by NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA? Well, this is where I'm pleased to say that the federal regulations really were improved by CalNAGPRA and the experience of those of you in California and comments that we received directly from tribes in California about how these regulations should be revised. And so central to the new regulations under NAGPRA is a requirement for deference to the traditional knowledge of Indian tribes. We have also included traditional knowledge in the definitions under the federal law. And the term that we've used and defined in the new NAGPRA regulations is Native American traditional knowledge. And the definition and obviously the terminology differs a little bit from what's found in CalNAGPRA. But the basic requirement here is the same, which is that there should be deference to tribal knowledge in the process of repatriation and certainly through the consultation process. In addition to the deference that's highlighted in the new NAGPRA regulations, the other big addition to the new federal regulations has been on restrictions for access, research, and exhibition of Native American human remains or cultural items prior to repatriation. This is titled the Duty of Care Requirements in the new NAGPRA regulations. It's received a lot of attention in the press for those museums that have decided to close exhibits or cover exhibits as a result of this duty of care requirement. But I think for you in California, you'll find that it's very similar to some of the California state law requirements certainly around access and research. Under the federal regulations, before any access, research, or exhibition, a museum or federal agency must have consent from the Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization to allow that access, research, or exhibition. So that is it's a change definitely in the regulations. As I said, it's received a lot of attention, but we feel at the Department of the Interior, it is absolutely in line with what Congress intended. And we have a very lengthy explanation for that in our regulations and in the final rule. And I would encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in better understanding how we came to this new requirement in the federal regulations. But I also hope that you'll see that it echoes very much what you have already in your California state laws. Mario, did you want to add anything to that last point?
I'll just add a little bit. I mean, I know looking around this room, I see some of the authors and the people who contributed to Cal NAGPRA. And I know that in writing that law, they really did put tribal rights first. And I think that it's really amazing to see that that has had a trickle down and moved its way into federal law as well. So just a big thank you to those who have come before me and done that work and seeing the real world impact of it today.
Yes, I also appreciate that and extend my thanks as well to those of you in the room. And I would be remiss if I didn't also point out that this is definitely how Congress intended NAGPRA to work in 1990. There's very clear statements from Senator Inouye as well as Senator McCain on the need for this legislation to reflect that deference to tribal knowledge and the significance of tribal input in the decision-making under NAGPRA. So I think that wraps up the prepared talking points that we had, and I think we can move on to Q&A unless you have anything to add, Mario.
I have one more thing to add. And one thing that we're doing right now is in response to both AB 389 and the requirements for system-wide and campus committees in the UC system as well. What we're looking for and what we're recruiting for right now is tribal voices with experience in repatriation, TIPO work, consultation with state or federal agencies to be voices on either the CSU or UC system-wide and campus committees. Each of these campuses have collections and are looking to repatriate them and move forward in those repatriations, but they do need guidance and they do need voices that are going to represent the ancestors in returning home. At the next commission meeting, which is July 16th at Grayton, the commission is going to be reviewing candidates for the CSU campus committees, but there are still vacancies both for the CSU committees and for one or two of the UC committees as well. I owe them an outreach letter. So we're going to be doing outreach, but we also, in events like this, it's really important to reach out to those doing the work. If anyone has any questions about that application process, I'd be happy to talk to them after this. Thanks, Melanie.
Certainly. And since I'm online, I'm going to go to an online question that we received. But I would encourage those of you in the room to make your way to the microphone so that we can answer your questions in real time. The online question that we have, I'll go ahead and read it, and then I'll provide my answer and turn it to Mario to respond. The question is, do non-federally recognized tribes need federally recognized tribal approval to view and handle cultural items or items that have yet to be deemed to be cultural items? And if so, what does this approval look like? Does a written notice suffice? And does approval only need to be granted from a single federally recognized tribe or all tribes that hold claim in the area? So this definitely goes to the new requirements in the federal regulations around duty of care and the requirement for consent to allow access to Native American human remains or cultural items. So the first part of that question really goes to a museum needs to know what it knows about the human remains or cultural items. And if they are human remains or cultural items, then the duty of care applies. where there are cultural items and the museum doesn't know if they are cultural items, or I should say if they're objects and it's unclear if they're cultural items, the museum has a decision to make about whether to restrict access to those objects or not. And that decision should be based on what the museum knows. Sometimes I give the example here of an object that's on exhibit, and if the label on that object says used in ceremony, that's probably a good indication that you might need to restrict access and exhibition of that object, and because that's central to the definition of a sacred object under NAGPRA. But of course, that's a very simplified response. In terms of limiting access to non-federally recognized tribes, yes, where a museum knows that an object is human remains or cultural items under NAGPRA and is potentially culturally affiliated to a federally recognized tribe, then access to that item or objects needs to be restricted until there is consent from the federally recognized tribes. Now, the question kind of goes on to say, what does consent look like? Is agreement from one of multiple tribes okay? That is really up to the tribes involved. So we have intentionally not produced any kind of template of what consent from a tribe might look like, because consent is fundamentally the right of that tribe to decide what that's going to look like. It is an exercise of that tribe's sovereignty to decide what that consent looks like. And I would add, it would also perhaps include other requirements in relation to providing that consent. So I can't tell you what consent looks like. The tribes can, however, tell you what their consent is going to look like. But until that's received, yes, a museum or a federal agency needs to limit access, and that would include to any state recognized or other groups that are not the federally recognized tribes that have potential cultural affiliation. Now, there are a variety of variations, and we could talk through scenario after scenario of these options and what if there is no potential culturally affiliated tribe? What do you do then? There's a lot of ways to answer those questions. My office has prepared some frequently asked questions around the duty of care issue. You can find those on our website, on our policy page. But beyond that, we're happy to work with any museum or federal agency on the specific issues that they're facing and in who's requested access, and whether or not that can be what their decision making needs to be. I want to emphasize again that it is a decision of the museum or federal agency how to apply that duty of care restriction and when consent is required. We can provide you guidance. We can provide you technical assistance and help you think of the questions that need to be answered. But at the end of the day, it is a decision the museum or federal agency needs to make on how they're going to limit or restrict access. Mari, I'm not sure if that's a question that you had anything to add to. That's a pretty federal one, I guess.
Nothing to add. Well said.
This would be the time if people want to come up to the mic and ask a question so that others can see, that'd be great.
Hi, Melanie. This is Kathleen Marshall from the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. You talked about extension requests for the 2029 deadline. How many requests can they make for extensions? And you said that there had to be approval from all parties. Does that mean that tribes have to approve the request for an extension? And I guess what I'd try to avoid is somebody applying for lots of extensions and us never getting the work done.
Yeah, thanks for that. We have experience with this extension requirement. So it's in the law itself that museums can request extensions, only museums, not federal agencies, let me be clear. The law only provides that museums can request extensions to the inventory deadline for human remains and associated funerary objects. So we have experience with this. And as I'm sure many of you in California who have been engaged in this work for the last 34 years are aware, Many of the institutions in California exercised that option for an extension from the 1995 deadline. So in revising the regulations, we sought to clarify the process for requesting an extension, first of all. Secondly, based on input we received during tribal consultation as well as during the proposed regulation stage, required that any request for an extension include consent from the consulting parties. So it is not approval necessarily, but it is there needs to be evidence of consent from consulting parties to the request for an extension. At that point, what the regulations do then is put the onus on the Secretary of the Interior to approve the extension request. In this case, the delegation has been to the Assistant Secretary. So the political leadership within the Department of the Interior is responsible for approving that request for an extension. How many extensions can be approved is not identified in these regulations. So in theory, there could be multiple requests for extension. And then in theory, they could be approved by the Department of the Interior multiple times. However, our experience with the 1995 deadline was that the department allowed 2 extensions, but after that did not allow any additional. So that would inform perhaps the department's decision around approving any extension requests in the future. But in part, the regulations don't say, but the regulations do firmly and squarely place that responsibility within the Department of the Interior. So I hope that answers your question.
Good morning. I am Melody McAdams. I work as the Tribal Heritage Manager for United Auburn Indian Community. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about repatriation statements. The tribe in their comment letter had really supported these because the experience had been that there were a lot of museums who were publishing their notices and saying, we're done with NAGPRA, when their museums hadn't actually repatriated anything, but they were considering themselves done because their paperwork was done. And the hope for us was that the repatriation statement would move tracking to actually getting the repatriations done versus finishing your paperwork. So I was hoping you could talk a bit more about what's on the forms and why they're important. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Melody. It's good to see you. I will. I'll go ahead and answer from the federal regulations, but Mario, I might want to turn it to you and how this process of a repatriation statement is kind of reflected in the NAGPRA process as well, because I think that's an important addition to what the federal law requires. So repatriation statements do finish the process. I will say that we were unable to do what many tribes asked us to do in the regulations, and that is to require some kind of confirmation of a physical transfer. So repatriation statements are intended to finish the legal process or the paperwork process, but they don't necessarily complete the physical transfer process, which can come at the same time or more likely comes after a repatriation statement. A repatriation statement is a written document that conveys any possession or control that the museum or federal agency has in the human remains or cultural items to the requesting party. So you can think of it as a legal transfer document that solidifies the decision of the museum, confirms the request from the tribe for repatriation, and completes the repatriation process. And I'm going to use an offensive term here, but it provides great clarity. It completes the transfer of any interest of ownership or interest at all, not ownership, but just interest that the museum or federal agency had in those human remains or objects to the appropriate tribe. We see that as completing the repatriation process. We had previously encouraged, but not required, the use of something called a transfer of control document. And the repatriation statement is intended to replace that and to make it required. We do hope that it's going to increase the transparency of the process because in addition to having notices available on our website, we intend to also have a date of when the repatriation statement was issued for that notice. We're still working on the technical side of that, but we've received a lot of repatriation statements already under the new regulations. There's also a timeline attached to a repatriation statement. A repatriation statement is required, again, 90 days after agreeing to a repatriation of human remains or after publication of a notice for cultural items. There's a difference in the process for summaries and inventories, but basically 90 days is the requirement for a repatriation statement. Now, I want to point out that that's a no later than date. So a repatriation statement could be sent almost immediately after a notice is published in the Federal Register. So on the 31st day after a notice publication, a repatriation statement could be sent. And for our purposes and for the regulatory process, it completes the paperwork and it completes the required federal process. Now, I want to echo what I know is true for so many tribes and so many museums, and we heard in many comments that this is not the end of the process. We understand that, but we think it's important that the regulatory process end with transfer of any interest to the tribe, because then the timeline is firmly in the tribe's hands with what happens next. And we didn't want these regulations to impose any kind of requirement on tribes for what occurs after that transfer of interest occurs. So we don't have any requirements for physical transfer. We don't have any requirements on reporting physical transfer. And we also understand that that's an incredibly important part and an incredibly burdensome part. But we thought it was important that these regulations not prescribe any actions for tribes once they have received that final piece of paper from the museum or federal agency that completes the repatriation process. I'll just, I think I'll end it there, but I'm happy to talk more about that or to let Mario speak to how this sort of might fit in with the NAGPRA requirements.
So Melanie, you made a really good comment about tribes defining consent. And I think as we've looked at NAGPRA and just looked at what repatriation is or is not, and what is the definition of repatriation, it's unique to each tribe. And each tribe can define what repatriation means to them based off the capacity that they have to receive repatriation at that time. NAGPRA has some restorative justice elements written into it that can assist tribes in advocating for repatriation that is satisfying to them. For example, there is different levels of repatriation. There's legal transfer of control, which is the bare minimum. There's a physical transfer of control. There's the potential for a legal transfer of a control, any delayed physical transfer of control, and maybe a sort of caretaking aspect on behalf of the institution so that the tribe can gain capacity. But I think at the end of the day, what true repatriation should be is a physical transfer of control that includes the land and the funds and the resources for a tribe to be able to do that without taking anything out, any resources out of their community to complete and restore the harm that has been done to them by having these ancestors held in collections. I know that it's something we're exploring moving forward at the commission on how to instill more restorative justice into the NAGPRA process in light of the NAGPRA process, and hearing about the transparency and the tracking. Maybe there's some way that the NAGPRA process can also take repatriation agreements that the NAGPRA process has had and have some sort of transparency as when was this actual physical transfer completed. And that's something that I think we're open to looking into as well. Thank you.
That's great, Mario. And I'll just add that this is a real great example of working better together. There are limitations to what the federal law can do and what the federal law can require, and that's based on the parameters of the federal law itself. But there are certainly ways that state law or policy directives by museums, states, federal agencies can go beyond that. So again, we often talk about the federal laws being the floor, and there can be additions to the top of that through the state law or through other policy or directives.
Tangwang Naang, Donna Miranda Begay, to Dal. I just introduced myself, Donna Miranda Begay. I'm with the Tabatalabal tribe of Kern Valley, and we're not federally recognized, but the other half of me, I'm Navajo, so that is recognized. This is more of a question for Mario in regards to Cal NAGPRA. I just caught wind, I think as of last year sometime, the terminology of the contact list maintained by the Native American Heritage Commission. I was the author of that idea because not being federally recognized, I had talked to Larry Myers back in 2002 for Senate Bill 18 on the Sacred Lands Act. And I remember seeing that come across my desk as I was working with the California Conservation Corps. And I thought to myself, wow, this is a great law. It's going to help move forward the tribe's involvement with protection of sacred lands. And I also saw that it was just for federally recognized tribes. And I was like, oh my. And so I talked to Larry and I had him incorporate the terminology that California Native Americans tribes would be both federally and non-federally recognized tribes, and those tribes listed with the Native American Heritage Commission's contact list. Now, I didn't define how that list was going to be maintained or disclosed or anything like that, but that came about later on in other legislations. So I'm hoping, because I'm not going to be able to make the Heritage Commission meeting on July 16th, I'll be down in San Diego attending a tribal GIS forum. But I really hope that, and I always say this throughout Indian country in the United States and also up in First Nations up in Canada, I'm so proud to be living in California and to be an Indigenous person living in California, because they're including all Indigenous peoples of California and not dividing a line when it comes to sacred lands, NAGPRA, our language, our culture, our heritage, our right. In 100 years now, we've been US citizens since 1924. Anyway, I just want to say, please, and I see the Heritage Commission Secretary Raymond Hitchcock here today, please make sure that our contact list remains in place and be very open to those people that are Indigenous to California so that we can continue to participate, if anything, in Cal NAGPRA. And I've been very successful, and I see Melanie out here and some other folks. And we created the first California State University's Tribal NAGPRA Council at Sacramento in 2006. And I'll never forget what Billie Allison Blue said. Panun used to be, she passed on. She said, number one, and it was funny because I was on the President's Advisory Council, and she said, number one, let's not fight. Let's not argue. This is about repatriation of things that belong to our culture, our circle, our being, our wellness. So let's not fight over this. Let's not argue. And I thought, wow, well said. So anyway, I will continue with that dialogue on behalf of Billy, a former member of the Ione Banner Miwoks, and also Marie Potts, who raised me in a good way, Maidu. So I was raised in a roundhouse. And so, Asana Teliwich Peniyu Omohits, bless the circle that connects us, and please take care of that terminology. Non-federally recognized tribes as listed with the contact list with the Native American Heritage Commission. please take this message back to your commissioners. Thank you, and thank you for the work that you guys are all doing. And I'm going to end on that, but that was kind of a question, but I just wanted to put that out. Please take care of that. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all the work that you've done. I'm happy to say that we are not only furthering the contact list, we're protecting it by creating regulations for that contact list. And so we drafted regulations and we went throughout the state and did listening sessions in order to hear the input and the feedback that tribal communities had on that contact list, and ensuring that that contact list is equitable for both federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes, given the rights that it gives those tribes to protect their cultural resources, their sacred sites, and their village sites. We are going to be going out for another round of tribal consultation because we've taken all of those comments that we received and we've done a significant amount of work to respond to those comments and make changes that are in light of what the community's voices have asked for. You'll likely see multiple rounds of tribal consultation throughout the state on the contact list. So we're working on it and we are making sure that it is around for a very, very long time. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Raymond Hitchcock, the Secretary of the Heritage Commission. I thought I'd throw a few questions at you for some clarity between CalNAGPRA and NAGPRA.
Do I get overtime?
Absolutely. Aren't you already on it? You talk about repatriation statements, that is in NAGPRA, which Melanie just talked about, was just the legal transfer. In CalNAGPRA, doesn't it give the authority of the commission to oversee repatriation agreements and make those mandatory?
Yeah, so the commission has the ability to track repatriation agreements and be able to post them on our websites for transparency. And I think moving forward, it'll be an internal discussion, but incorporating restorative justice on making sure that physical transfer happens after the legal transfer of control happens.
So is it your legal opinion, or is this just an idea at this point that repatriation agreements are something that's like you said, the Fed is the base, CalNAGPRA could be the secondary piece where we have the ability to enforce repatriation agreements and make sure that transfer actually happens?
That's a memo.
Thank you very much. Next question for you guys. As Melody talked about in NAGPRA, it says they can have consultation with non-federally recognized tribes or tribal groups. In CalNAGPRA, it requires that consultation. So did I hear it correctly that does FedNAGPRA trump CalNAGPRA in that, or are institutions still required to consult with non-federally recognized tribes?
I don't like to use such black and white terms as something trumps something else. I like to talk about how NAGPRA as the federal law really is the foundation, and there's room for CalNAGPRA so long as it doesn't butt up against the federal law. So CalNAGPRA requires consultation with both federally recognized tribes and non-federally recognized tribes. If that does not occur, that is a violation of CalNAGPRA. But what that means is, dependent on the interpretation of CalNAGPRA. But we understand that NAGPRA and Melanie are encouraging consultation with every tribe that comes before them. So it's not black and white. We're really trying to encourage consultation and relationship building and resource exchange in the event that there are objects that there is no cultural affiliation to a federally recognized tribe that's found. And then there's a non-federally recognized tribe that is willing to receive those objects. Those relationships have been built. So that's what it's encouraging. We're trying not to look at this in the punitive way, as in, oh, you're violating CalNAGPRA. We're trying to look at this in a way of how can we encourage people to adhere to the consultation requirements in CalNAGPRA while also not stopping repatriation or slowing repatriation under NAGPRA, because that really is the goal, is the return of the ancestors and affiliated objects.
I just want to thank both of you for all the work you're doing with NAGPRA. Thank you.
I just want to let people know Melanie is still watching. Even if you don't see her on the screen, she's still there. So please feel free to ask your questions. And I have one for you all. What is, can you better define the difference with the new AB 389 and its application? There she is. There have been some promotion of the idea that AB 389 ends California archaeology, and that now smaller historical museums are trying to basically offload their collections because they are no longer allowed. So if you could just kind of talk a little bit, as much as you feel comfortable, about what really is there, and maybe a little bit about how consultation works in this regard. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think, Wendy, what you're talking about is some of the language in AB 389 that discusses a prohibition on research and testing. And, you know, there is a lot of pushback in the osteo or the ARC or the academic community that is dehumanizing Native American ancestors. And what that prohibition is, I'm on a working group with the CSU committee right now, the CSU working group, to develop a policy to navigate what it looks like to pursue NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA and repatriation as an institution. And there's been a lot of pushback as to professors arguing with this prohibition on research and testing. But there is aspects in that where tribal requests for research or testing, or tribal requests to teach their old ways to other, to maybe monitors that they want to train in the future. So I think it's less about the end of a certain field and more about the evolution of that field to be respectful of the communities that they have been studying and trying to make money off of for all these years. So it really is a shift to more of a consent-based and a respectful-based academic research. I hope that was helpful.
Good morning. It's Patty over here. I wanted to ask you a question. When could we expect to have accessible some, like a flow chart on how NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA can work together? I think what a lot of people are experiencing is fear in consultation, maybe because they haven't really done a lot of it, and they've done basically the minimum of what's required under the law. And the new addition of CalNAGPRA and then the final rule is kind of a scary obstacle, I think, for some practitioners. And I think the other part of it is fear of confrontation between themselves and maybe a tribal representative or a community having feelings and expressing their opinion and them being the receiver on that end. So I was wondering also if there was going to be some guidance provided on how to navigate those kinds of interactions. I used to work for a tribe. I worked for a tribe for 17 years, and so I'm comfortable in that area. But a lot of people that work for universities or museums don't have that kind of experience. And I think a lot of the stress is fear-based. Thank you.
Great questions, Patty. Full disclosure, I worked with Patty at that tribe for about 5 years, so good to see you. I will say, as far as a resource, we do have a flow chart regarding CalNAGPRA. It's a little dated right now after the new federal regulations came out that we are working on revising internally. And we have been looking at ways to create a visual to show how NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA work together. It's a difficult visual to create just because there's little pieces here and there, but that is our goal of ours for our legal department of 2, is to produce a flow chart or some sort of visual for people to share. And that is, Patty, that is something as well, I think that, we've talked about in general at the NAHC, helping with cultural competency and helping with creating comfort in a space that maybe people are not used to entering. But, that's one of those things that's on the list. But as we all know, we do have limited resources. But we are always, Mario and I, some of you in here have probably already spoken with us. We're always open to get on the phone with people. We're always open to help open up dialogue between people. So we're there as a resource as well. If whether you're from an institution or whether you're from a tribe and you would like to talk to somebody and have a dialogue, we're willing to all get people together on the phone and work together. So I do agree with you, Patty. There can be some discomfort on especially I think from institutions, right? You're hearing some really raw emotional thoughts coming from people about what you've done to their community and what you've done to their ancestors, and that's hard, I think, for people to receive. And so it would be great to have some sort of training or resource for that, and maybe that'll be the next working group.
I would just like to add a little bit to that. This is obviously something that has been a barrier in NAGPRA for 34 years, that fear. And, I can only speak for myself, but certainly as a representative of the federal government, I often receive, I'm often on the receiving end of people's anger and frustration over the role of the federal government in Indian country. It's awful. It's terrible. And yet I still work for the federal government. And for me personally, the way I reconcile it is that I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to change this process. And I think that for any museum representative who is in that fear-based place, one thing they can do is just realize that sometimes we have to be a receiver of that anger and that fear and that pain so that we can move on and get to a different place. That's at least for me personally how I deal with it. I think the other thing that I often tell museum folks when they tell me they're, maybe they don't say they're afraid, but that's what's really behind the delay or the issue. It's not going to be better by waiting. In fact, the sooner you start talking about it, the sooner you start confronting the issue, the better it's going to get. That's the only way it's going to improve, and ignoring it's not going to help. So, I my sort of casual advice to anybody is always to think of the immortal words of Vanilla Ice and to stop, collaborate, and listen, and that will get you very far when you're doing this work, and especially if you're scared to get started. We have 2 questions online. I'm a pretty casual person in case you aren't familiar with my style, but that sums it up right there. We have 2 questions online that I'll go ahead and read and respond to. One question is that I'll read the question. I have already received correspondence from a number of museums stating that they are now consulting with federally recognized tribes and pulling back on consultation with non-federally recognized tribes. I would like to better understand whether CalNAGPRA consultation is no longer necessary or required once consultation under NAGPRA has begun for a collection. I think this is kind of a question for you, Mario and Michelle.
Thank you. Yeah. Until the federal process is over, consultation with non-federally recognized tribes is required under CalNAGPRA. So that consultation should continue. And there's reasons for that. There's reasons in the sense that this is a relationship that you have with the non-federally recognized tribe as an institution, one. Second, there may be some repatriation that happens as a result of a federally recognized tribe receiving repatriation under NAGPRA and then choosing to have an agreement with that non-federally recognized tribe to transfer the cultural items or human remains to that non-federally recognized tribe. So it's important that, as Melanie says, there's collaboration. And that is a requirement under CalNAGPRA. It's a conversation that needs to be had. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the question gets to some situations that have been brought up to us, which is where a museum has maybe been working with a state recognized tribe and has perhaps not engaged with the federally recognized tribes that have some rights. And so obviously the federal law requires that federal consultation. And so certainly that is also required. So where a museum has only been working with a state recognized tribe, there may be some catch-up work to do in terms of ensuring that the federally recognized tribes have been made aware and are engaged in the process. The next question is, what happens if two non-recognized tribes ask for repatriation? How do museums determine which tribe the item should be repatriated to? This is a question that comes up in various ways, and I would say this is somewhat similar to some of the scenarios, Mario, that you and I worked on in the April workshop that we participated in. And, where there are two non-federally recognized tribes who have made requests for repatriation, the federal law is going to require that the federally recognized tribes be engaged in consultation or at least be invited to consult. And then depending on what kind of objects or ancestors are being requested and the information related to that collection, the federal law is going to dictate perhaps some different paths down which the next steps might take. I think that from our perspective, what's important to know is that requests from non-federally recognized tribes do not delay or pause the federal timeline. There's still requirements under the federal law for certain documents to be completed and certain decisions to be made by museums. And the requests from the non-federally recognized tribes can't pause that process. But there are lots of outcomes, I guess, to this scenario of two non-federally recognized tribes making a request. It's going to depend a lot on the circumstances of what's being requested.
Good morning. I just wanted to speak a little bit more regarding this issue of consultation, especially when it comes to federally recognized tribes and non-federally recognized tribes and the repatriation process. I think our experience has been that the consultation process often gets weaponized and used in a way that does not advance repatriation. And I think that's a good thing to be aware of and to maybe take a step back and say, is this the real issue or is there a different issue that's going on here and sort of being framed as this other issue? Because as someone who has worked through a lot of these consultations where multiple entities are involved, often the consultations are done in a way that stalls out the process, where you're like, actually, I'd really like to resolve this and get it going together, but perhaps the museum is not letting the different tribes meet together. So you don't even know that these issues are happening as a tribal representative. And you don't know who that museum is speaking to for the unrecognized tribe to be able to reach out and say, hey, would you like to work together? So there, I have seen a lot of museums kind of weaponize this to say, hey, we can't do your repatriation yet, this other tribe asked to consult. And often we'll say, that's a reasonable request. We're not asking you to not consult with them. You should consult as required. But we do want you to move the repatriation process along. And, federal NAGPRA has a requirement to inform tribes of all the tribes that they're consulting with, which can sometimes feel like pulling teeth from the museum of just saying, hey, be clear and transparent about everyone who's in the room and the discussions that are being had. Because our experience was that we weren't trying to get into these conflicts, but that we were having museums almost set up these conflicts. And it was very difficult to get out of them even when we wanted to. So this is something that has been very frustrating in the last year. Thank you.
There's another question online, and since it's really for the NHC, I'll go ahead and ask it. This is from Marianne Parra. Here in California, non-federally recognized groups only need to have a 501c3 and no other proof that they are actually Native. Many non-Native people are participating in consultations and taking items from personal collections all under the guise of being Native. What is being done to correct this wrong and ensure people are actually Native?
As we say at the Native American Heritage Commission, it's not our role to say who is Native or who is a tribe per se. So as far as who an institution engages with, who they choose to consult with, as long as they are following federal NAGPRA, if they're subject to it, I don't see a space in Cal NAGPRA to sort of be the consultation police, other than to encourage consultation and encourage consultation with as many groups and individuals who represent groups who are interested in what that institution may be holding. I do know that there are a lot of politics surrounding who may be a non-federally recognized group. We get that. We try not to wade into those politics. That's what's made the contact list, which was referred to earlier, the process of creating regulations for that contact list. What's made that difficult is that we understand there are a lot of politics surrounding this, but we just don't have a role in, going and talking to an institution and demanding to see proof of who they're speaking with. Is really that non-federally recognized group that is saying who they are. And I get that these are issues, but we can only do so much at NAHC. But if there is a question you have for us that we could help as far as understanding the process or access, we're always open. Mario and I are very, very open to speaking with people and hearing your concerns. But we will not be, going to UCSB and saying, okay, we demand to know who you're talking to and we want proof of who they are, and we're going to police that. We just don't do that.
Hello, Nikia Zavala, San Ynez Chumash. This question is for the NHC. So if we find tribes find themselves, and non-federally recognized tribes, in competing claims, how does the NHC plan to mitigate those issues? And if there's a process in place that you can refer to.
Well, I can tell you that there is in Cal NAGPRA a dispute resolution process that NAHC can help facilitate and get mediation going. However, the mediation parameters depend on whether the dispute is arising between tribes and an institution that are subject to NAGPRA or subject only to Cal NAGPRA. If an institution is subject to only Cal NAGPRA, then the dispute resolution provisions in Cal NAGPRA are something we're facilitating. We're actually working on regulations for that. If the dispute arises under federal NAGPRA, we'd have to be able to talk about what it, because there's, if you look at the Fed regulations, if there's a question of human remains, the institution's supposed to determine that. There's also possibility under federal law, obviously, to go to court. So we would have to talk about this. It's so fact specific. I hate to give, a clear yes or no, and not clear, a definitive answer on that. But if an institution is subject to only CalNAGPRA, we do have the dispute resolution process in CalNAGPRA that's laid out, and we do offer mediation through that. If the institution's subject to NAGPRA, we'd have to talk about it and see what CalNAGPRA, how CalNAGPRA can work with that, or if NAHC is able to offer that mediation.
I think these people are scared to come up here and just ask their question. I'm going to lean a little bit on something you said before, which was you don't want to interfere with who the museums are consulting with. But my understanding was under the law, there was supposed to be the contact list that museums use to determine who they were contacting for CalNAGPRA concerns. So can you clarify?
They do use the contact list, but what I mean by that is we're aware of situations where there are people on the contact list, groups on the contact list, and there are other groups saying they shouldn't be there. They're not that, we don't at this point, we're not getting in between that. The contact list is what it is right now. We are working on improving the contact list through regulations. And if there is a dispute between groups of you're not really who you say you are, but they're on the contact list, and thank you for bringing that out. That's if you're on the contact list and you're being consulted with, we're not going to get into the middle at this point of should that group be on the contact list, because we don't have regulations for that right now, and we are working on promulgating those. And then in the future, if somebody is not on the contact list and there is consultation occurring, then of course they shouldn't be consulting with that group anyways. But that's different. I think I was maybe listening, maybe I didn't quite understand the question fully, but yes, if both groups are on the contact list and there's consultation occurring, then that's appropriate. Now, if there's somebody that's not on the contact list and they're consulting, please let us know and we can talk to the institution and try to figure out what is happening.
We had another question online. This may seem like a basic question, but how does an institution determine if they are required to do NAGPRA or CalNAGPRA?
Melanie, this might be one of the few NAGPRA questions I can answer. It comes down to funding, and I know that NAGPRA has resources that describe specifically what is funding on their website. But if you receive federal funds as an institution, you're subject to NAGPRA. And if you receive state funds, you are subject to CalNAGPRA. It is often that institutions receive both state and federal funds, so they are subject to both. Thanks. You can add to that if I missed a bunch, Melanie.
No, that's correct. And I would just, yes, it includes grants is the follow-up question online. In fact, receipt of federal funds includes even pass-through funding or sub-award funding. So it's important where an institution knows that it receives California state funding to identify if the source of that California state funding is actually federal in its first instance, because a lot of federal programs, for example, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, awards federal funds to states that then filters that funding out to local historical societies, local libraries, local museums. So that state funding is actually really federal funding. And so you've got to kind of understand what we call in the federal government the color of the money and where it's coming from, because in those cases, it may be both state and federal funding at the same time.
But you,
They've
want me
got you,
to-
Patty.
do we want to wait for Melanie to jump back on?
If your question's for Melanie, yeah, I probably. Good
No,
idea.
it's for you.
Oh, okay.
So in regards to state funding, in my experience from my former position in attempting to consult with a local museum who receives both federal and state funding, their positioning was that they were not subject to NAGPRA. And I'm interested in finding out if the NAHC or the granting entity within the state is going to be providing information on the requirement to comply with NAGPRA and how you might imagine that looking if it's not already in existence.
I would think that sounds like a matter of education. So if you know of we'll have
Well, I'll send a list of institutions that I think need to be contacted.
Patty has a list. All right.
Okay, I think maybe you lost me there.
We lost you momentarily when you were discussing the pass-through grant situation. Mario finished as best he could, though.
Okay, the bottom line is that state funds could also be federal funds at the same time. And it's important to know, as we say in the federal government, the color of the money and where it's coming from.
Here, Kelly Carrillo. I am working as the repatriation coordinator for Fresno State University. And my question was just around the committees. So I guess this is for Mario. You mentioned those earlier. I've been asked by a couple of different tribes in the area in the valley about the process. And I think it's just been confusing because there's the CSU, the UC, and then the system-wides. So what I did was just got all the documents and kind of reshared it and tried to explain the process. But one of the questions was they haven't heard anything back, and this was a tribal leader. And then the second question was, how do I know which, I guess, committee to apply for, which is, I can't tell them which committee to apply for, but I think it's just really a little bit of confusion on the process. So I tried to explain in person and via email that because we really want the tribes to be involved. But is there a person or a place that they can get kind of an overview? I just want the tribes to feel more comfortable because we need their participation.
That's a great question. So for every application that we received, we reached out and thanked them for that application and said that we'd be in touch. We did reach out to all candidates that were qualified for the campus committee, and we interviewed them. We did lose a few to spam folders. We got a lot of rejected emails. People aren't used to getting emails from the NHC. So we followed up with phone calls in a lot of those situations as well. We've conducted over probably 80 interviews. And on the next commission meeting, we have 38 candidates that are going to be presented to the commission to be on those committees. After that commission meeting, since at our last one, we only nominated about 4 to 7 maybe, we're going to be having a list on our website that shows both the UC and the CSU vacancies that are current. And so that will be a little bit more transparent. And then since we had such a large volume of candidates and we reached out to everyone, what our next step after this initial push is to kind of do some due diligence and see where we didn't get responses, where we might have gotten emails bounced back or gotten spam foldered.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And we have another one online from Whitney. How do we encourage agencies and museums to respond or research in a timely manner? It almost feels like if there aren't clear deliverables and deadlines, it just gets added to the list of to-dos. And for larger state agencies, that makes progress incredibly slow. I know the laws have timelines, but it almost falls to the tribes to be the bad guys and either bug the agencies and museums or report these agencies to the NHC and NAGPRA program.
Well, I can go ahead and respond on the part of the federal NAGPRA process. I appreciate and understand that position that many tribes feel that they're put in trying to enforce the requirements under NAGPRA. That's certainly not the requirements under federal law, although some tribes find that to be effective. And I will say that our goal with the revised regulations is to give clear timelines so that in communicating with museums, tribes can be clear on what the regulatory requirements are. So not the tribe's timeline, but the regulations timeline. And of course, we are always happy to serve in that education role for museums. So where a tribe is working with a museum that doesn't seem to understand the process or the requirements, we're always happy to work with that museum directly or work with the tribe and the museum collectively. However, I want to stress, as many of you know, we don't step in unless a tribe might ask us to. So certainly there are some tribes who prefer to have that active role and to not involve the federal government in that process. And where that is the tribe's preference, we respect that. But if a tribe ever wants to ask us to step in, we're more than happy to do so. It would just require, letting us know who you're working with and if we can work to then support you or to educate the museum in their responsibilities. I will say that NAGPRA does have an enforcement piece. Civil penalties can be alleged against a museum that has failed to comply. And part of the effort, again, with the new regulations is to ensure that there are clear deadlines so that there can be some action taken to allege a failure to comply if those deadlines are missed. I would encourage the person who asked the question and for those of you that are tribal representatives in the room to maybe have some more discussions about this, because I think many tribes have found effective solutions to this problem. Others have great template letters for the sort of angry letter that they send to a museum when they fail to meet a certain deadline or to respond in a timely way. So I think there are lots of examples that tribes can draw on from each other.
Did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Nope, I think that was a great answer.
She's had practice. There's another question online from Jessica McFeeters for the NHC. Should we be sending letters requesting consultation to the whole NHC contact list for a county or rather to the tribal contact specific to the geographical location of where the cultural resources were removed? Additionally, how often should we be requesting updated contact lists?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is up to the institution of the museum, based off the information that they have, to reach out to those tribes that they believe are culturally affiliated or potentially culturally affiliated. So based off of unique circumstances of each collection or each accession, that could change by county or by geographic location, ancestral maps. There's also, as far as the NHC contact list goes, you can request updated contact lists from us at any time.
Good morning, Marisa Yeager from Cal State San Bernardino. There's been some concern expressed on, as we are in the transition, as NHC are evaluating the applicants for the local campus committees. Are there discussions post July 1st if the local campus committee is not completely filled? What work can continue to be done or not done until that committee is completed? There's some concerns that have been expressed by the supporting staff to want to make sure the work continues and conversations continue without too much break until that committee's filled. So we would appreciate some of that guidance.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, it is one of the challenges of policy work is that the policy is not intended to stop respectful repatriation moving forward. Yes, there is a need for committees. Yes, there is a need for tribal voices. However, if you have consultations with tribes and you feel that you are compliant with the NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA process, those repatriations should be moving forward. It's also something that we're discussing as we develop a system-wide policy. A system-wide policy, as it's being developed, shouldn't block repatriation moving forward that has had years of work leading up to it as well. The intention of AB 389 was to ensure respectful repatriation. And so I know that the authors would want that to continue to happen as the results of that statute are being in effect as far as policy and committees go. Great question. Thank you.
I always have questions, so this one is really kind of for Melanie in terms of one of the newer aspects of the regulations has to do with the reporting of collections that are in museums that belong to federal agencies, and also federal agencies letting tribes know where the collections are and what maybe hasn't been included in a notice prior to 1990 or after 1990. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Wendy's referencing two different provisions that are sort of catch-up provisions in the new regulations. Since 1990, federal agencies have had responsibility for collections that came from their lands or were generated by their actions, is the language in the previous regulations. However, as many of you are aware, the collections that ended up in repositories were often not reported or were reported by the repository as being under federal control, or the federal government reported them or was unaware of them. There was lots of issues around who had responsibility for those collections. And so in the revised regulations, it's in 10.8C. It requires museums that have collections that are federal collections to report those collections to the federal agency with a copy to my office by January of 2025, so 6 months from now. Those museums must report those federal collections to the federal agency. The federal agency then has 180 days or 6 months to respond to that statement and say that they accept control, they do not accept control, or that they want to move forward jointly with the museum. We have included in that requirement that if a federal agency fails to respond within 180 days, they are assuming responsibility for the collection. So this is our attempt to solve this longstanding 34-year problem about who's responsible for these collections by first making museums tell federal agencies and then making the federal agency respond to try to clear up this very longstanding issue that really should not have existed. And as I think many of you are aware, the burden has really been a lot of times on tribes to resolve this problem, and that's absolutely not the way it should be. So we're hoping that this is a solution to this problem. The other piece that Wendy referenced actually is in the part of NAGPRA that we don't talk about very often in these kinds of sessions, and that is under subpart B, the process for NAGPRA on federal or tribal lands after 1990. So as hopefully you're all aware, on federal lands or on tribal lands after the passage of NAGPRA, there was no longer a way that collections could become collections. Things that were removed from federal or tribal lands were supposed to be transferred to the tribe, or I should say, given to the tribes without making any more collections. Congress was trying to stop this problem of collecting, at least as far as it could on federal or tribal lands after the passage of the act. The reality is, though, we know that many federal agencies removed Native American ancestors and objects from federal land after 1990 and have not completed the process of disposition. And so there's another a requirement in the regulations that actually within just 2 weeks, by July 12th, federal agencies must inform tribes of those pending dispositions that they have, so that the dispositions can then be completed or at least move towards completion within the next 6 months. So again, by January of 25, the goal is that we'll clear up any of those collections that, or any of those items. I need to stop using the term collections when referring to this. Any ancestors or objects that have not completed that disposition as required by the law can be on that path forward to resolve those issues. So those are the two deadlines when it comes to federal agency collections.
Just a follow-up question for Melanie regarding federal collections. As a museum, we continue to find out from federal agencies holdings that are under their control that we didn't know were under their control. So I'm wondering what the workflow should look like moving forward for resolving those collections following January 2025, if they can continue to reach out to us to let us know that those collections are under control, or if there'll be a centralised resource that everyone can sort of refer to see what sites are under agency control and compare that to their collections.
So I think it's important to sort of reorient the question a little bit, because NAGPRA is focused on the collections as opposed to the sites, say. So the physical geographic location, we're talking about the physical boxes, for example, in a museum as a repository. This is why we've focused the requirement on museums, because presumably a museum knows how many boxes, or generally where boxes are. And the requirement here is for the museum to look at its information to see if those are federal collections. And if they are, to then send that statement to the federal agency. I'm going to slow down here in case we've lost them again for those of you online.
I actually unmuted you on my own computer so you could finish. So if you want to repeat your answer, we'll make this work. We've got 3 more minutes.
Okay. So the onus is on the museum to identify those collections that it has that are in fact under the responsibility of the federal agency. In cases where a federal agency has identified work that it supported and that was done on its land and is coming to a museum to say, these are our collections, well, that's that's kind of the opposite of what the regulations require, but can certainly still be done and is an effective way of resolving the issue. I think that after the January 25 deadline, if a federal agency were to come to a repository and say, those items that you have from our collection are ours, they're not yours, then that's a point of discussion between the museum and the federal agency at that point. Certainly the museum can say, yes, they are, and continue, or the museum might have some disagreement there, especially if they've already engaged in consultation and working towards repatriation. But I think the overall goal is that we can at least identify the bulk of these issues by requiring museums to make those statements to federal agencies initially. It's not going to solve all the problems, but I hope that it will solve a majority of them.
Thank you. I had one last question. There's been great discussion about the contact list, which I know is very helpful for museums. What is needed is something similar for tribes. To my knowledge, there's no museum contact list. If you are a tribe and you're wanting to ensure that you're done with repatriation, for example, let's say that you want to make sure that you have repatriated everything from a specific site, or just that you're done. There is no central list of museums that you can send your email blast or letter blast out to be like, hey, do we have everything from your area? And that would be really helpful, and it's really needed, because on the tribal side, you want to make sure that you're finishing repatriations, and there are a lot of museums that just aren't publishing their notices. The Heritage Commission did a great list of agencies for AB 52. So a similar list like that of museums with contact information would be really great. And if there's already one that we don't know about, please let me know. Thank you.
Thanks, Melody. I think as we're staffing up more and more and we're hiring, that will be something we look at.
I think this is going to be our last question for this panel. And this one is really for the NHC. How about most likely descendants? Are there claims to items considered before that of a federally recognized or non-federally recognized tribes? Can an individual make a request for repatriation? What is the list of authority that institutions should be defaulting to?
I think when you use the term most likely descendant, which is an NAHC term, but I also hear some NAGPRA language in there as well. So I'm wondering if this is the lineal descendant piece of NAGPRA, so it would actually be to start off with Melanie?
Yep. Thanks, Michelle. I had the same question about the question. And definitely lineal descendants, which are present day living people that can trace a ancestry to an earlier person that can be identified. So again, people to people relationship, lineal descendants have priority under NAGPRA over federally recognized tribes. And lineal descendants do not have to be members of federally recognized tribes. Lineal descendants do not have to have permission from a federally recognized tribe. There is a recognition in NAGPRA of the rights of a next of kin, as we would talk about it under our common law procedures. The same applies in NAGPRA for lineal descendants. But I'll turn it back to you, Michelle, to talk more about the CalNAGPRA term there.
Well, most likely descendants actually not even found in CalNAGPRA. It's a separate process under California state law when there's an inadvertent discovery of human remains during earth-moving activities. So I think we're having some blending there. If not, if the person online could clarify, but I think it was the lineal descendant piece of NAGPRA is what I heard in the question, but if not, please let me know.
I can actually think of a few of these situations. So there have been instances where an MLD process has been engaged, but the remains for whatever reason or the collection was not put into the ground, was not reburied, but actually placed for care at a museum or university. What happens to those collections? Are they then still under the responsibility of the most likely descendant and need to come and have a different place for them to go to get finally reburied? So what is the NHC's sort of perspective on this? Because that does happen. And then, so that's the only scenario that I can think of to sort of follow back up, and she may want to provide a little bit further guidance, but it does happen. So it's great to have your comment.
And we've been involved in that recently. It's very fact specific. It has to do with timing and what went on. We did have one situation where there was a most likely descendant identified by the Native American Heritage Commission, and unfortunately, somebody that was involved in the archaeological dig decided to take part of an ancestor as almost like a trophy and took it back to the university. And so then it became basically part of this ancestor wasn't where the ancestor was supposed to be. So the question came to us very fact specifically, how do we deal with this? So that's, we really can't give like an overarching answer to that question because we have to know all the facts. And again, Mario and I will talk to anybody and we'll work through it, we'll walk through it, and we'll rope in poor Melanie to make sure that, we're not helping an institution violate federal law. It's all really a lot of working together and getting all the information and exchanging that information and getting the best result in the most legally, the most legal way and also the best way to do it. So we're here to help, basically. Yeah, we're from the government, we're here to help. You heard that before, but we will talk to anybody and we will work through these situations.
With that, I'd like to really say thank you to our panelists and for all of your questions. And we're going to take a break. So please return in 15 minutes or within 15.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Thank you.